Hello and welcome back to our channel. We often talk about muses as if they are passive things, beautiful objects of inspiration. But Ann Reinking was never passive. She wasn't just the clay, she was a collaborator. She wasn't just a reflection of Fosse's genius, she was a light so bright that it forced his own to become sharper, more focused, more daring. Her story has so often been told as a chapter in his, a footnote in the legend of the great Bob Fosse. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? What if the shadow we thought she was standing in was, in many ways, one she helped to cast? This is the story of the woman who didn't just dance the Fosse style, but who came to define it, to preserve it, and ultimately to step out from behind the shadow and claim her own spotlight. This is the story of Ann Reinking. To understand Ann Reinking, you have to understand the world she was about to enter. The America of the late 1960s was a country in the midst of a seismic cultural shift. The optimism of the post-war era was curdling. The Vietnam War was raging. The civil rights movement was challenging the nation's soul, and a counterculture was questioning every established rule. And on Broadway, the change was just as profound. The era of the grand, sweeping, optimistic musical, the Rodgers and Hammerstein world of wholesome romance and soaring melodies, was beginning to feel quaint, like a faded photograph from a bygone time. The audience was changing. They were more cynical, more sophisticated. They wanted something that reflected the messy, complicated, and often dark reality of the world outside the theater doors. And a new kind of creative force was ready to give it to them, the director-choreographer. And the king of this new era was Bob Fosse. Fosse wasn't interested in pretty balletic leaps or cheerful tap numbers. His work was different. It was slinky, suggestive, and deeply, deeply human. He took the imperfections of the body, a turned-in knee, a hunched shoulder, a jutting hip, and turned them into a vocabulary of raw emotion. His dancers were sexually liberated, world-weary, and simmering with a nervous energy that felt utterly modern. It was a style born out of the strip clubs and burlesque houses he'd known as a young man, polished with a Broadway sheen. He was creating a new kind of beauty, one that found grace in the awkward and poetry in the broken. It was into this electrifying, demanding, and often punishing world that a young dancer from Seattle, Washington was about to walk, ready to make her mark. Ann Reinking was not born into the grit of New York City. She was a product of the crisp, clean air of the Pacific Northwest. Born in Seattle in 1949, she was a child of seemingly boundless energy and laser-like focus. While other kids were playing, Annie, as she was known, was in the dance studio. She started ballet lessons as a young girl, and it wasn't just a hobby, it was a calling. Her parents, a homemaker and a hydraulic engineer, fostered this passion, recognizing in their daughter a discipline that was almost unnerving for her age. She was a natural, but she was also a worker. She studied at the San Francisco Ballet during the summers, and after high school, won a scholarship to the prestigious Joffrey Ballet School in New York City. At just 18 years old, she packed her bags and moved across the country, landing in the epicenter of the theatrical universe. For a young dancer, New York in the late 1960s was both a wonderland and a gauntlet. The competition was brutal. Thousands of talented young people poured into the city every year, all vying for a handful of spots in a Broadway chorus. Reinking, with her famously long legs, fiery red hair, and an undeniable spark, quickly found work. Her first big break came in 1969 when she was cast in the chorus of Coco, a musical about the life of Coco Chanel, starring the legendary Katharine Hepburn. She was just a face in the crowd, one of many dancers, but she was on a Broadway stage. She followed that with a role in Wild and Wonderful, a show that closed on opening night, a classic Broadway baptism by fire. But then came the show that would change the trajectory of her life and career forever. Pippin. Pippin was a Bob Fosse show. And from the moment Ann Reinking stepped into that audition room, a new chapter began for both of them. Fosse was already a giant. He had won a Tony for directing and choreographing Sweet Charity and an Oscar for directing the film version of Cabaret. He was at the absolute peak of his creative powers. He was also a notorious perfectionist, a demanding taskmaster whose rehearsals were legendary for their intensity. Reinking was initially cast as a replacement in the ensemble, but Fosse saw something in her that went beyond her flawless technique. It was an intelligence, a sharpness, an ability to convey complex emotion through the smallest of gestures. He saw a dancer who didn't just execute steps. She understood the psychology behind them. He began to pull her out of the chorus, giving her featured moments, molding her into the quintessential Fosse dancer. Their connection was immediate and electric, and it wasn't just professional. Fosse was a notorious womanizer, a man whose personal life was as dramatic and complicated as any of his stage productions. He was, at the time, married to the equally legendary Gwen Verdon, his first great muse and collaborator. But the magnetic pull between Fosse and Reinking was irresistible. They began a love affair that would last for years, a relationship that would define both of their lives, for better and for worse. She became his leading lady on stage and in life. When he created his semi-autobiographical plotless dance review Dancin' in 1978, Reinking was its undisputed star. The show was a pure celebration of dance, and it was a brutal, athletic, and exhilarating testament to her stamina and artistry. Night after night, she commanded the stage, her body a vessel for Fosse's most intricate and demanding choreography. It was a triumph, earning her a Tony nomination and cementing her status as a true Broadway star. Perhaps the most surreal and telling chapter of their story came in 1979 with the release of Fosse's film masterpiece, All That Jazz. The film is a thinly veiled phantasmagorical autobiography, with actor Roy Scheider playing Joe Gideon, a Fosse-like director-choreographer who is dancing, smoking, and sexing his way to an early grave. And playing the role of his loyal, long-suffering, and deeply loving girlfriend, Kate Jagger, was Ann Reinking. She was essentially directed by her real-life lover in a movie about his life, playing a fictionalized version of herself. She was reenacting arguments they'd had, conversations they'd shared, moments of intimacy and pain, all for the camera. In one of the film's most iconic scenes, she performs a stunning athletic dance for Gideon in his apartment, a piece titled There'll Be Some Changes Made. It's a performance simmering with love, frustration, and a desperate plea to be truly seen. It was art, imitating life in the most raw and exposed way imaginable. Years later, Reinking would reflect on the strangeness of it with a kind of wry detachment, saying, "The good thing is that it's there. It's on film. Our relationship, in a way, is on film. And that's unusual." Unusual is an understatement. It was a public dissection of a private love affair, and it remains one of the most astonishingly meta moments in cinema history. But being the muse to a self-destructive genius takes a profound toll. The story of Ann Reinking is not just one of spotlights and applause. It's also a story of quiet strength, resilience, and the deep, often invisible scars of a life lived in the orbit of a turbulent star. The Fosse style was notoriously hard on the body. It was built on unnatural angles, intense muscular control, and a kind of coiled tension that could be devastating over time. For Reinking, the physical price was steep. She danced through chronic pain, hip problems, and injuries that would have ended the careers of less determined performers. She once described how Fosse would push them to hold painful positions, like an unnatural slump, for minutes on end until it became second nature. He was training their muscles to speak his language, but that language was often a painful one. There's a quiet heroism in that, in the sheer physical grit required to show up every day and contort your body into a vessel for someone else's art, knowing it was slowly but surely breaking you down. The emotional toll was perhaps even greater. Loving Bob Fosse was a complicated, all-consuming affair. He was brilliant, charming, and charismatic, but he was also possessive, insecure, and serially unfaithful. Reinking existed in a delicate and often painful triangulation with Fosse and his estranged wife, Gwen Verdon. It's a dynamic that could have easily curdled into bitter rivalry, but one of the most remarkable and rarely discussed aspects of Reinking's character was the profound respect and genuine affection she held for Verdon. She never saw herself as Verdon's replacement, but as her successor. She understood that Gwen was the original, the architect of the Fosse style, alongside Bob himself. Reinking spoke of Verdon with a reverence and warmth that was truly extraordinary. She once said, Gwen was, always is, and will be a seminal part of Bob's life. I didn't want to get in the way of that. I couldn't get in the way of that. Why would I want to? In that simple statement lies a world of emotional intelligence and grace. She accepted the complexity of the situation, navigating a minefield of potential heartbreak with a maturity that defied the drama. She and Verdon eventually forged their own unique bond, a sisterhood born of their shared, singular experience of loving and surviving Bob Fosse. And then there were the parts of her life that had nothing to do with Fosse at all, the parts that often get lost in the telling of his story. After her relationship with Fosse ended, she sought to build a life and career on her own terms. She moved to Hollywood, starring in films like John Huston's big-budget movie musical Annie, where she played Daddy Warbucks' graceful secretary, Grace Farrell. The role was the antithesis of the dark, sensual Fosse aesthetic. It was warm, sweet, and wholesome. She also starred opposite Dudley Moore in the comedy Mickey and Maude. She was proving that she was more than just a dancer. She was a versatile actress with charm and comedic timing, but perhaps the most profound turn in her personal life came with motherhood. Reinking stepped away from the relentless pace of her career to raise her son, Christopher, who was diagnosed with Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder that affects the body's connective tissue. This decision reveals a side of Reinking that the Broadway lights couldn't capture: the fiercely protective mother, willing to put her own ambitions aside for the well-being of her child. It was a quiet, private chapter of her life that demonstrated a depth of character far removed from the high-stakes drama of her years with Fosse. It showed a woman defining her life not by applause or accolades, but by love and responsibility. These hidden struggles and private joys paint a much richer portrait of Ann Reinking, not as a supporting character in a man's story, but as the protagonist of her own deeply human experience. The central controversy, or perhaps more accurately, the central debate surrounding Ann Reinking's career, is a question of authorship and agency. For so long, the narrative was simple. Bob Fosse was the genius, and Ann Reinking was his perfect instrument. He was the creator, she was the interpreter. But this simplistic view does a profound disservice to them both. It diminishes Reinking's own creative intelligence and misunderstands the very nature of their collaboration. Was she a muse, or was she a co-creator? The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the murky, beautiful space in between. Fosse didn't just dictate steps to Reinking, he built them on her. He would suggest a movement, a feeling, a shape, and she would inhabit it, explore it, and give it back to him with something new an unexpected nuance, a sharper line, a deeper emotional resonance. Her body and her dance intelligence were his laboratory. He was discovering his own ideas through her. Dancers who worked with them described a kind of nonverbal shorthand between the two, a creative dialogue that was almost telepathic. He would mumble a suggestion, and she would translate it into a fully formed, breathtaking piece of movement. To call her merely an interpreter is to ignore the vital role she played in the act of creation itself. This debate came to a head in the years following Fosse's death. He died suddenly of a heart attack in 1987 on the opening night of a revival of Sweet Charity in Washington, D.C. Reinking was with him when he collapsed. His death left a huge void in the world of dance, and it left Reinking with a new, daunting responsibility. She was no longer just his muse. She was now one of the primary keepers of his flame. The original 1975 production of Chicago, directed and choreographed by Fosse and starring his wife Gwen Verdon, had been a moderate success, but it was overshadowed by the runaway phenomenon of a chorus line. 2 decades later, the Encore's concert series in New York decided to mount a stripped-down concert-style version of the show. They asked Ann Reinking to choreograph it in the style of Bob Fosse and to star in it as the murderous Corinne, Roxy Hart. This was a perilous task. Reinking had to do more than just remember the steps. She had to climb inside Fosse's choreographic mind to understand the intent behind every gesture and then reimagine it for a new generation of dancers and a new audience. It couldn't be a carbon copy. It had to have its own life, its own pulse. This is where the debate over her role becomes so fascinating. She wasn't just recreating, she was curating, editing, and reinvigorating. She knew which moments needed to be preserved exactly as Fosse had conceived them, and which could be adapted or given a new spin without losing their essential Fosseness. The result was a theatrical lightning strike. The concert was such a massive runaway hit that it transferred to Broadway almost immediately, where it is still running today, the longest-running American musical in Broadway history. The revival was a triumph, a sleek, sexy, and cynical masterpiece that felt more relevant in the celebrity-obsessed 90s than it had in the 70s. And at the heart of its success were 2 women, Babe Neuwirth as Velma Kelly and Ann Reinking as Roxy Hart, with Reinking's choreography driving the entire production. For her work, Ann Reinking won the 1997 Tony Award for Best Choreography. It was the ultimate validation. Standing on that stage, accepting the award, she wasn't Bob Fosse's muse or his girlfriend. She was Ann Reinking, a Tony-winning choreographer in her own right. She had taken the legacy entrusted to her, honored it, and then elevated it into something that was hers too. She had solved the historical debate with a single, stunning artistic statement. She was not just the keeper of the flame, she had used it to light her own torch. The long-term impact of Ann Reinking's life and work is as profound as it is poetic. Her significance unfolds in 2 distinct yet deeply intertwined acts. The first is her role as the definitive vessel. For generations, she was the living library of the Fosse vocabulary. To watch footage of her in Dancing or All That Jazz is to see the style in its purest, most potent form. The precision, the coiled power, the effortless sensuality. She didn't just perform it, she embodied it. She set the standard. Every dancer who has attempted a Fosse piece since has, in some way, been measured against the ghost of Ann Reinking's impossible grace. But if her story ended there, she would remain a brilliant but ultimately secondary figure. It's the second act of her career that truly cements her historical importance. After Fosse's death, she underwent a remarkable transformation. From interpreter to guardian, from dancer to choreographer, from muse to master. Following the success of Chicago, she conceived and co-directed Fosse, a 3-act musical revue celebrating his life's work. It was another monumental undertaking of historical curation. Working closely with Gwen Verdon, she taught a new company of dancers, the Fosse Canon, passing down the knowledge that had been poured into her. The show was a hit, winning the Tony Award for Best Musical in 1999. It was the ultimate tribute, and it was a project that only she could have spearheaded. What we can learn from Ann Reinking's story is a profound lesson about art, love, and identity. Her journey teaches us that influence is not a one-way street. She was not just a passive recipient of Fosse's genius. She was an active participant, a collaborator whose own talent and intelligence shaped the very work we attribute to him. Her story forces us to rethink the romanticized and often sexist notion of the muse. It demands we see such relationships as complex partnerships, full of dialogue, tension, and mutual creation. Ann Reinking still matters because she represents the quiet, often uncredited labor of love that underpins so much of great art. She is a symbol of artistic stewardship, of the immense responsibility that comes with inheriting a legacy. But most importantly, she is a testament to the power of self-reinvention. She spent years as the other woman, the second great love, the brilliant dancer in the shadow of a towering figure. But through her resilience, her intelligence, and her unwavering dedication to the work, she managed to step into the light and define her own legacy. She ensured that the language Fosse created would continue to be spoken, but in doing so, she added her own indispensable voice to the conversation. In the end, the story of Ann Reinking is one of quiet, determined evolution. It's a journey from being the perfect embodiment of a style to becoming its most essential guardian and champion. She began as the dancer who could flawlessly execute Bob Fosse's vision, the woman whose body was the canvas for his art. But she ended as the artist who ensured that canvas would hang in the gallery of greats forever. There's a fragile beauty in her story, a tale of a woman who navigated a life of immense professional highs and deep personal complexities with a rare and tenacious grace. She understood the shadows because she had lived in them. She knew the weight of a legacy because she had carried it on her own famously elegant shoulders. She never fully escaped the association with Fosse, nor did she ever seem to truly want to. She recognized that their story was inextricably linked, a tangled, beautiful, and painful knot of love and art. But what she did, and what remains her most powerful act, was to gently pull at one of the threads of that knot and weave it into a new pattern, one that was unmistakably her own. She taught us that a shadow is not an empty space. It is a place of depth, of nuance, of quiet observation. And sometimes it is from the very heart of that shadow that the most enduring light emerges. Ann Reinking was more than the woman behind Bob Fosse's shadow. She was the one who kept the light on, ensuring that we could all continue to see the dance. And for that, the worlds of theater and dance are forever in her debt.